Welcome to Somali Nexus. We are on this journey through the powerful legacies of Somali and Islamic history. I believe that looking back helps us move forward, understanding our past, whether through the lens of Islamic scholarship, trade, or governance, can empower us to navigate modern challenges with wisdom and confidence. My passion for history began with a simple realization. So much of our story remains untold. From the mighty Ajuran Sultanate, which controlled vast trade networks, to the strategic brilliance of the Warsangali and Majertan Sultanates, Somali rulers played a key role in shaping the Horn of Africa. But the story doesn't end there. We'll also explore the legendary Ifat Sultanate, a powerful Islamic kingdom that laid the foundation for resistance against Abyssinian expansion, and the Adal Sultanate, known for its fearless leader, Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as Ahmed Guri, who led one of the most formidable military campaigns in East African history. These empires weren't just local powers. They were key players in the broader Islamic world, connecting trade, scholarship, and military strategy across continents. History isn't just about the past. It shapes our identity today. How did these sultanates influence modern Somali political structures? What lessons can we learn from their leadership, diplomacy, and resilience? These are the questions that drive me as a host of Somali Nexus. History belongs to all of us. Whether you're a Somali in the diaspora, reconnecting with your roots, or someone passionate about world history, this podcast is for you. Somali history is vast, rich, and deeply intertwined with global movements, from Africa to the Middle East, from Asia to Europe. Our goal is to bring these connections to life in a way that is engaging, educational, and most importantly, inspiring. So sit back, tune in, and let's embark on this journey together. This is Somali Nexus, where the past meets the present.
Welcome to Somali Nexus, the podcast where history, culture, and legacy intersect. I'm Gould.
And I'm Zara. Each episode, we explore the rich and often untold stories of Somali history, connecting the past to the present.
Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of Somali Sultanates, the medieval power struggles, and their role in the broader Islamic world.
From the mighty Ajuran Empire, which controlled vast trade networks, to the fierce Sultanate of Ifat, Adal Sultanate, and the legendary Warsangali and Majertan Sultanates, Somali rulers shaped history in ways that still echo today.
And we're not stopping there. We'll explore how these legacies influenced modern Islamic powers, the role of Somali scholars, warriors, and traders in the wider Muslim world, and what lessons history holds for today.
So get ready for a journey through power, diplomacy, and resistance, because Somali history isn't just a footnote. It's a force.
All right. So today we're tackling Somali Sultanates. And let me tell you, these weren't just like tiny kingdoms or anything. We're talking big, influential empires that were shaping the Horn of Africa for centuries.
Yeah, it's really a story that challenges a lot of the simplified narratives you often hear about Africa, for sure.
And get this, we even found evidence of Somali city-states that were trading with, wait for it, the Roman Empire.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating connection, isn't it? Really shows you how long Somalia has been plugged into these global networks.
So where do we even start with a history this big?
Well, we've got to start with the arrival of Islam in Somalia. I mean, do you know that Islam actually took root in Somalia even before it reached parts of Europe?
Seriously? I had no idea.
Yeah, we're talking 7th century here. And just to give you a sense of how early that is, the mosque in Zayla, which was a major port city back then, dates back to that same era. It's older than some of the most famous buildings we know in Europe.
That's wild. Okay, so Islam's arrival was obviously a huge turning point.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about religious conversion, though. It had a profound impact on the way the sultanates were structured and how they rose to power, their legal systems, their administration. A lot of it was influenced by Islamic principles.
Makes sense. Okay, so with that in mind, let's zoom in on one of the most famous Somali cities, Mogadishu.
Ah, Mogadishu.
Yeah, we've all heard the name, but I'm guessing most people don't realize just how powerful it was back in the day.
You're telling me. Imagine this. From the 10th to the 16th centuries, Mogadishu was like the New York City of East Africa. Sure?
Okay, I'm picturing it. Bustling streets, traders from all over.
Exactly. It was this massive port city, minting its own currency, attracting merchants from as far away as China.
They were basically running their own Wall Street back then. So, what made Mogadishu so successful?
Well, geographically, it was in a prime spot, right on those major trade routes connecting Africa, the Middle East, and Asia.
Location, location, location.
Right. So they could control the flow of all these valuable goods like ivory, gold, textiles, things that were in high demand back then.
So they have the geography, but you don't build an empire on geography alone. What else were they doing?
Right. Well, they weren't just traders. They were also really skilled diplomat. In fact, a 13th century traveler, Ibn Said al-Maghribi, he actually called Mogadishu the leading Islamic center in the whole region.
Wow. High praise from someone who had clearly seen a lot of the world.
Exactly. And then later, the famous explorer Ibn Battuta, he visited in 1331 and was just blown away by how big and wealthy the city was.
So it wasn't just hype. They were really living up to the reputation.
Oh, yeah, for centuries. It's amazing, really, when you consider the challenges Mogadishu faces today.
It really shows how much things can change, how the tides of history can shift.
Yeah, that's for sure. Now, while Mogadishu was thriving on the coast inland, you had another fascinating sultanate making waves, the Ajuran.
The Ajuran, huh? Yeah.
And they had a pretty serious obstacle to deal with, the Portuguese.
Oh, yeah, the Portuguese. They were a major maritime power back then, big time.
So how do you think a sultanate and the Horn of Africa managed to resist them?
I mean, we're not talking about a small skirmish here, right?
Yeah, definitely not. Yeah, the Ajuran, they were known for their military skills, and they really knew how to use the terrain to their advantage, forming alliances with local communities, that kind of thing.
So smart tactics, not just brute force.
Right. And you know what's fascinating? They actually fought off not only the Portuguese, but also the Oromo people, expanding their territory significantly throughout the 16th century.
Talk about a double victory.
For sure. It really speaks to their resilience and strategic thinking.
It's like they were playing a real life game of risk and winning.
Huh, that's a good way to put it.
But they weren't just focused on military conquest, were they?
Oh, not at all. In fact, their military successes were closely tied to their economic power. The Ajuran had these extensive trade networks that stretched across Asia and even into Europe.
Ah, so they knew how to play the economic game too.
Oh, yeah. That trade brought in wealth, which they could then use to fund their military, and it gave them leverage in diplomatic negotiations.
So they were winning on multiple fronts, military, economic, diplomatic. Pretty impressive for sure.
And speaking of impressive, they weren't just traders and fighters. They were builders too.
Oh, yeah? Did they build?
Well, I mean, think about it. They didn't have any fancy technology back then, but they built these impressive fortifications, sophisticated water systems, some of which are still in use today.
Wow, that's a real legacy for sure.
So we've covered a powerful inland empire and a major coastal hub. Ready to head back to the coast for another story?
Absolutely. Hit me with it.
Right. So along the coast, you had the Somali Sultanate. They controlled a huge chunk of coastline from like the late 13th century all the way until the British showed up.
Wow, so they were around for a long time. Longer than some of these others we've talked about.
Yeah, they had some serious staying power. And like Mogadishu, they were in a prime spot for maritime trade. They had connections all across the Indian Ocean.
I'm sensing a theme here. Control the trade routes, control the wealth and the power.
Exactly. And, remember those ancient Somali city-states we mentioned that were trading with the Roman Empire?
Yeah, those were super interesting.
Well, Some historians think those cities with names like Mosalan and Opan were actually located in what later became more Singali territory.
No way. So we're talking about a region with like a history of trade that goes back thousands of years.
It really is mind-blowing, yeah. And it just goes to show how connected the world has always been, even in ancient times.
So much history we don't even know about.
Right, right. Okay, now things are about to get a little more intense as we move inland again.
Uh-oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, as powerful as the Warsangali were, there were other forces rising to power in the Horn of Africa, especially those aiming to unify Muslim territories.
Okay, this is interesting.
So in the 13th century, you have the rise of the Ifat Sultanate. They were led by the Walashma dynasty.
The Walashma. Who are that? And why did they want to create this unified Muslim state?
The Walashma were a powerful clan, and they saw an opportunity to bring together different groups under a shared religious and cultural identity. Yeah, kind of like other empire building efforts we see throughout history.
Unite and conquer, right?
Yeah, something like that. But their ambition led them straight into conflict with a major power, the Christian Ethiopian Empire.
Oh, wow. So you've got these two empires clashing, religions clashing, different ideologies. This is a recipe for like some major drama.
Oh, yeah. It had huge consequences. You see, control of trade routes was a key factor in the region's power dynamics. And the Ifat Sultanate's expansion brought them right up against the Ethiopian Empire, which of course wanted to control those routes too.
So it wasn't just about religion then, it was about economics too.
Absolutely. Control of trade meant control of wealth, control of influence. It's classic power politics.
Did all this tension lead to an actual war?
Yep. There were a series of battles that went on for decades. Eventually, the Ethiopian Emperor Amda Seyon I, he defeated the Ifat Sultanate in 1332. But the idea of a unified Muslim state that didn't die with their defeat.
Well, it sounds like the fight wasn't over. So who picked up the torch after the Ifat Sultanate fell?
Well, that would be the Etel Sultanate. They were established by this coalition of different groups. Somali tribes, the Afar people, Arabs, even some folks from Harar.
Okay, so a really diverse mix of people.
Yeah, it was this interesting mix of cultures and backgrounds. And like the Ifat Sultanate trade was a big part of their story. But they weren't just focused on regional trade. They actually had connections all the way to South Asia.
Wow, so their reach was pretty extensive. Did they leave behind any physical evidence of this success? I mean, aside from the historical records, of course.
Yeah. Actually, one of the most fascinating things about the adult sultanate is its architecture. They have these thriving cities like Abbas and Berbera, which are sadly lost to time now.
Lost cities? That's crazy.
Yeah. It's like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. But the archaeological evidence suggests these cities had impressive mosques, palaces, all kinds of public buildings.
It makes you wonder what else is out there just waiting to be discovered.
Totally.
Okay, so we've been talking about empires rising and falling, these like massive trade networks. But what about the everyday people who lived in these sultanates? What was life like for them, say, in Mogadishu during its golden age?
That's a great question. And, you know, while most of our sources focus on the big political and economic events, we can get some glimpses into daily life.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, Ibn Battuta, remember that traveler we talked about earlier? He described Mogadishu as having like an abundance of livestock and fruit. So that suggests they had a pretty strong agricultural sector.
Okay, I can picture it. Bustling markets filled with fresh produce, the port bustling with ships coming and going, people from all over mixing and mingling.
Yeah, it was probably a very vibrant and cosmopolitan place, a world away from
how we often imagine Somalia today. Sadly, that's true.
But it's important to remember that even amidst the power struggles and conflicts, People were living their lives, raising families, running businesses, contributing to their communities.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history isn't just about kings and queens and battles. It's about regular people too. Okay, I'm curious. We came mentioning these incredible structures, mosques, palaces. What can we learn from these buildings about the people who built them?
Well, they give us a glimpse into their beliefs, their artistic tastes, even their technical skills. A lot of the mosques and palaces, for instance, they show this blend of local Somali architectural traditions with influences from Arabia and Persia.
Ah, so it's not just goods being traded, but ideas and artistic styles too.
Exactly. It was a real cultural exchange happening through these networks.
We've been talking a lot about the men who ruled these sultanates, but what about the women? Did they hold any power or influence?
That's a really important question. And unfortunately, a lot of the historical sources are pretty silent on the specific roles women played.
Yeah, that's a common problem in history, isn't it?
It really is. But we do know that in some sultanates, like the Ifat Sultanate, there were queens or queen mothers who had a lot of influence within the court.
That makes sense, especially given how important family ties were in a lot of these societies.
Yeah, for sure. And even if they weren't in official leadership positions, it's pretty safe to assume women played vital roles in their communities.
Absolutely. Running households, raising children, working in the economy. These are all crucial contributions that don't always make it into history books.
That's so true. It's important to remember that the official accounts don't tell the whole story.
Right. We have to read between the lines.
Exactly.
Okay. Just to make sure our listeners really grasp how big these sultanates were, can you give us a sense of their geographical reach? I mean, we've been throwing around a lot of names and places.
Sure. At their peak, these sultanates controlled a big chunk of modern-day Somalia, parts of Djibouti, even bits of Ethiopia and Kenya. So imagine a map of the Horn of Africa with this huge swath of it under the control of the Somali Sultanates.
Wow, they really dominated the region. And those trade networks we talked about, that must have amplified their influence even further.
Absolutely. They were a major force in the region, and their connections extended far beyond their immediate borders. But of course, no empire lasts forever.
That's true. We talked about conflicts with external forces like the Ethiopians and the Portuguese, but did the sultanates ever fight among themselves?
Oh, absolutely. Even though they shared a common religion and culture, they were still separate political entities, each with their own ambitions and interests.
So you had all these powerful rulers, each trying to get the upper hand.
Exactly. It's a classic story. Competition for resources, for territory, for power.
What were some of the biggest conflicts between the sultanates?
Well, one example is the rivalry between the Ajuran Sultanate and the Adal Sultanate in the 16th century. They were both really powerful, and their ambitions clashed, especially over control of trade routes and resources in the Ogaden region. So they ended up fighting a series of battles that actually weakened both of them in the long run.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if they had been able to cooperate, maybe they could have resisted those external pressures more effectively.
It's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, as we said before, no empire lasts forever. So what ultimately led to the decline of these once powerful Somali sultanates? Well, like we mentioned earlier, colonialism played a huge role. I mean, by the 19th century, European powers were kind of running rampant across the globe, weren't they? With their advanced weaponry and, that insatiable desire for resources and territory.
And even the Somalis alternates, as resilient and adaptable as they were, they couldn't escape this wave of imperialism.
No, they couldn't. It was a global phenomenon, and it really reshaped the political landscape. We talked about that treaty the Habio Sultanate signed with Italy in 1000 and 188.
Yeah, that seemed like kind of a turning point.
Yeah, it really was. That treaty basically made Habio a protectorate of Italy. And after that, it wasn't long before other European powers were moving in, carving up the region and basically imposing their rule on the remaining sultanates.
So they were caught between these internal struggles we talked about and these external pressures from these expanding European empires.
Exactly. It's a sadly familiar story. These once powerful societies getting dismantled by colonial forces.
It's a reminder that it's often not just one thing that leads to the downfall of an empire or a society. It's usually this combination of internal and external pressures.
Absolutely. Just like competition between sultanates could lead to conflict, internal disputes over things like succession, resources, or even political control, those things could also weaken them from within.
So the Somali Sultanates, once these dominant forces in the Horn of Africa, they eventually succumb to colonialism.
Yeah, it's a story that's both inspiring and tragic in a lot of ways. But I think it's important to remember that their story doesn't end there.
Right, right. I mean, what about their legacy, their impact on Somali culture and the region as a whole?
Yeah, that's what's really fascinating. I mean, their legacy is multifaceted, right? On the one hand, they left behind this rich cultural heritage that still shapes Somali identity today. We've talked about the architecture, but there's also all this oral history, poetry, chronicles that have been passed down through generations.
And those trade networks, they build all those connections that must have left a lasting impact on the region too.
Oh, definitely. For centuries, they played this really key role in connecting the Horn of Africa to global trade, bringing in goods, ideas, people from all over.
So even though the sultanates themselves are long gone, their influence is still felt.
Absolutely. And I think by understanding their past, we can better appreciate the present and even the future of the region.
This has been a really incredible journey through Somali history. We've covered so much: powerful empires, trade, lost cities. What do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
Well, I hope they come away with a sense of awe, a realization of just how rich and complex Somali history really is. These sultanates weren't like static entities. They evolved, they adapted, and they ultimately left this, indelible mark on the region and the world. So I went with this idea that if we look back on, these really...
Yeah, it's a really powerful reminder that Africa has this long and vibrant history that's often overlooked or misunderstood.
It really is. And the story of the Somali Sultanates, it challenges us to rethink our assumptions and to recognize the interconnectedness of everything, even going back centuries.
I love that. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Somali history.
My pleasure. It's always fun to explore these stories.
And to everyone listening, we hope this has sparked your curiosity to learn even more. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you next time.